So once again, in app component, we have this field courses with 3 objects. Now let's simulate something. Let's simulate a scenario where we get these courses from the server. So in our template, I want to add a button on top. Let's call this load courses. And when we click this button, we're going to execute load courses method. Okay. Now back in the component, I'm going to add this method, load courses. And then I'm going to set this courses field in that method. So delete. And we set this dot courses to this array. So when we call this function, we're going to initialize this courses field. Now in this particular demo, we're going to explicitly load the courses, but in a lot of real world applications, this happens automatically when you land on a page. Now, don't worry about that aspect. What we are focusing on here is that every time we click this button, we are resetting this courses field to a new array. Okay, so save, back in the browser. Now I'm going to open up Chrome Developer Tools and put it on the left side of the screen. So inspect, it's here. Let's expand the body element. Here's the app root. This is our button. Now I'm going to click this. All right, look, we have a UL, and this is where we have our courses. So a UL with 3 LIs, right? Now look what happens every time I click this button. You will see a quick purple highlight on the left side of the screen. Look, do you know what that means? That means every time we click this button, Angular is reconstructing this UL element. Look, now this is so fast, it doesn't have any performance overhead, but if you're working with a large list or a list with a complex markup, and sometime during the life cycle of your page, you're going to call the backend to download these objects, Angular is going to reconstruct this entire DOM object tree. And this can be costly if you're dealing with a large complex list. Now let's see how we can optimize this. Angular by default tracks objects by their identity. So here we have 3 objects. These objects have 3 different references in the memory. When we reset this courses field, even though we're dealing with the exact same content, as in course with ID 1, course with ID 2 and 3, but these objects will be different from the previous ones in the memory. So Angular sees this as new content, and that's why it reconstructs that DOM tree. Now, back in our template, here in the ngFor directive, we have this ability to change how Angular tracks objects. So as I said, by default, it tracks them based on the object identity, which means the reference of that object in the memory. So if we re-download course with ID 1, every time we re-download that course is going to be a different object in the memory, even though the content of those objects are going to be equal. Now, we want to instruct Angular to use a different mechanism to track objects. So instead of tracking them by their identity or the reference in the memory, we want to track them by their ID. So course with ID 1 is always course with ID 1. So if you re-download the exact same course from the server and none of the properties are changed, Angular will not re-render that DOM element. So here we add track by, and we set this to a method in our class. Let's say track course. Note that here I'm not calling this method. I'm simply adding the name of the method as a reference. Okay. Now let's go ahead and implement this method. So back in our app component, I'm going to add track course. This method should take 2 parameters, index and course. Now here we want to check if we have a course object, we want to return its ID. Otherwise, we return undefined. Now with this method, we change how Angular tracks course objects. So instead of tracking them by the object identity, it tracks them by their IDs. Let's try this. Back in the browser. So I'm going to click load courses. Now here, look, this is where we have the list of courses. So a UL and a bunch of LIs. Now I'm going to click load courses several times, and you will no longer see that purple highlight on the left side of the screen. See? Nothing is happening. So Angular is not re-rendering this UL and its children, because every time we reset our courses field, we're using the same course objects. These course objects have the same ID. So here's the lesson. If you're dealing with a simple list, don't worry about the Trackby feature. You don't need this. Angular performs well out of the box. However, if you're dealing with a large list with complex markup, and you do observe performance problems on a given page, you can try using Trackby to improve the performance of that page. So don't use it by default in every page, because you have to write more code and you won't gain any performance benefits. So use it only when you need to.